Hi guys, welcome to lesson 2 of the ecosystems unit. Today we are going to be looking at what global ecosystems are and where they're located, and the better term for them is a biome. As always, the activities to watch this video, there will be opportunity for you to pause it if I ask any questions, and then the final task is for you to upload your answers onto Show My Homework as normal. Okay, so a bit of a recap then. In our last lesson, we were looking at something called a food web. Now, if you did the task, what a lot of you did was you told me the difference between a food chain and a food web. So, for example, on the slide here is a food web. We've got our oak tree. The flow of energy is going to the caterpillar, to the blackbird, and then the hawk. The better term, or the term when we're seeing these interactions, is an ecosystem. So this might be showing a small park or small forest ecosystem, but the food web itself shows the flow of energy. Today, we're going to be looking at an ecosystem on a much bigger scale. We're going to be looking at something called a biome. Now, a biome is essentially a large-scale ecosystem, and they are defined mainly by the dominant type of vegetation that grows in that region. And that definition is going to make a lot of sense in a minute when I go on to our next little map. Okay, so the large scale ecosystems, known as biomes, and they're mainly defined by the dominant type of vegetation that grows in the region. So this on here is a little map of those world biomes. And on first glance, it looks very complicated. Notice we've got all the different colours on here. At the bottom on the key, we've also got what each of the biomes are called. So for example, the green colour here is showing tropical forest. You might have heard that known as rainforest. So anywhere that is shaded in green on this map, that is saying that if I was to go to that location, it would be a tropical forest ecosystem. If we look at our definition again, it means that those ecosystems, those locations would all be dominated by the same type of vegetation. So that's saying that if I was in South America over here, or I was in Africa over here, or I was in Southeast Asia over here, which are all the tropical forest biome, I would find very similar trees, I'd find very similar soil, I'd find very similar plants and animals that are living there. So for example, one of the main animals that live in the rainforest biome would be a monkey. I would most likely find monkeys in Indonesia and Southeast Asia over here, in the central of Africa over here, and in South America over here. I would also find, like I said, the same species of tree, and they would look very similar. If you were an expert in the tropical rainforest biome, you would be able to tell me that one was maybe South American and one was African. But for most people, they would look very similar. Quick question then, and pause this video. I'm going to ask you, can you tell me what the main biome is in the UK? And can you tell me what the 5 biomes are in Australia? Okay, so in the UK, the main biome is called a temperate forest. And in Australia, we've got the temperate forest, we've got tropical forest, we've got the chaparral, we've got a savanna, and we've also got a desert as well. Now, a lot of these words might be completely new to you. We're going to go over a couple of them in a minute, but I'm hoping you understand here that what it's trying to say is that we can divide the world into these different biomes, and they are very large scale ecosystems. So, for example, if I'm in the UK here and I went to perhaps Germany or even parts of sort of Russia over here, the forests, the ecosystems that I find there are likely to be very similar. If any of you have ever been on holiday to parts of Spain or Portugal, or maybe Italy or Turkey, when you got to that location, you might have noticed that it felt or looked different to the UK. The trees that are there, maybe the climate that's there, maybe the species that are living there as well might be different. That's because they are the chaparral or the Mediterranean biome, And it's slightly different. Again, if I lived in Italy and I went over to maybe Spain or Portugal, the biome would feel very similar as well. Some countries, like Australia, like China, like the USA, are so large that they actually have multiple different biomes within them. So if I started in New York in the USA and moved west towards LA, I would cross over several different biomes on my way there, which I think is rather interesting. So, what we'll do is I'm going to walk you through a couple of the different biomes. The first one we talked about was the tropical forest or the rainforest. They tend to be located very close to the equator, which is that middle line of latitude. The rainforest receives very high temperatures and is also very wet as well. Linking back to our weather topic, it's very wet because along the equator there is a huge low pressure belt. And if you remember, low pressure is where we get lots of heat rising, forming lots of clouds and lots of rain. They cover about 6% of the Earth's surface, and more than half of the world's species of plants and animals live in the rainforest, and about a quarter of all our medicines also come from rainforest plants. So, as a biome, as a global ecosystem, it is very important. Above and below the rainforest, we find deserts. Now, deserts are really large. They cover about 1/5 of the world's land surface, and they're very hot. In contrast, in the opposite to the tropical rainforest, the deserts are very dry because they have a high pressure weather system. And again, if we think back to before we were off, the high pressure is where that hot air is starting to cool and it's starting to come back down to earth. And because the air is falling, we're not going to get any moisture in the air, we're not going to get any clouds forming, and therefore it's going to be very hot. As such, very difficult for an animal or a plant to survive in the desert. So, on that map as well, you would have seen the temperate and coniferous forests. Another word for temperate is deciduous. Now, we have deciduous forests in the UK. All right, and the thing to kind of remember about a deciduous forest is they lose their leaves during winter. So if you go outside in autumn or in winter around where you live, you notice that the trees are either bare or they get those lovely autumn kind of images where all those brown leaves are on the floor, and that's because in the winter months, the trees shed their leaves to try and maintain moisture. They don't want to lose their water essentially. The other type of forest, and you find these more in parts of Canada and Siberia, in Russia, is a coniferous forest or an evergreen forest, you might have heard it called as well, basically Christmas trees. Now, they have these pine needles to keep the moisture in, and they keep their leaves all year long. That's because, we'll look in a minute, in a coniferous forest, they're quite far north and south in our latitudes, so they don't get very much sunlight. So they need to keep their leaves, even in winter, to make sure they can have enough photosynthesis to survive. The next two biomes, and again, hopefully you will have heard of definitely the polar one, we have our polar and tundra biomes. Now, the polar biome, think of the Arctic and Antarctic. It's super low temperature, it's very dry, it's places like Antarctica and Greenland. The tundra is slightly different. If you look down here, it's still very cold, but there are little bits of green appearing now. So it's still a very barren. It's still a very tough place to survive. The temperatures are below freezing for most of the year. However, there are some ecosystems that are there. So things like reindeers can survive because they can eat the small leaves that kind of shoot out of the ice itself. And the final one, we have something called a temperate grassland we'll look at. Again, you can see on the map here where these are located. So mainly in North America and parts of Asia as well. They include vast areas of Greenland, and they're mostly found in places like Mongolia, Tibet, China, and the USA as well. So if I quickly go back to this map here then, hopefully now you can see that the tundra is located to the far north up here. The polar would be at the very top and very bottom. The desert is this grey area here, so places like the Middle East, Northern Africa, parts of the USA, parts of Asia. The Boreal Forest on here, which is this kind of yellowy colour, that's another word for a coniferous forest, so those evergreen trees. And then in the UK, we've got those deciduous forests, or another word for it is the temperate forests as well. Okay, bit of a recap then. At the start of this year, we looked at a word called latitude. Now, latitude is the distance north or south of the equator. So if we look at our little diagram here, we've got the equator, which is this red line. We can be north or we can be south of the equator. It goes up in degrees all the way up to 90 up here and 90 down there. When we were looking at the weather, we worked out that at the equator it was warmer, and the further north or the further south away from the equator that you go, the cooler it tends to get. And that explains quite a lot when we're talking about why the global pattern looks like this. So, I told you at the very start, if I was to follow my red line here, there are some slight alterations to the pattern, but in general, if I was to follow this line of latitude across the Earth, I would find tropical forest most places that I've visited. And that's because the biome, the types of plant animals that live there, are impacted by the climate. And at that line of latitude, the climate is very, very warm, there's lots of water, and therefore those types of plants and animals will be able to survive. If I were to draw another line in a very northern latitude, up here, so maybe the tundra, again, the climate of the tundra, very cold, very dry, and therefore all these areas along that line of latitude would all have similar ecosystems because they're all adapting to the same types of climate. And that basically explains the patterns. There are some obvious differences. This purple line here is mountains, very, very cold in a mountain. But generally the pattern suffices. And this only became really realistic to me about 5 years ago, I'd say. I was able to go visit Japan. And when I got off the plane to Japan, I was really, really shocked. Because normally when I've visited places around the world, for example, places like Vietnam, places like Australia, you have that feeling when you get off the plane that it feels different to the UK. So have you ever had that where you get off and it feels really hot, or you can feel the humidity in the air? And when I got off the plane in Japan, I've been traveling for nearly 20 hours, but the actual climate itself felt very, very similar to the UK. When I was walking around the parks in Tokyo and I went to some of the forests, they looked very, very similar to what I'd seen in Europe and in the UK. And it only dawned upon me that if you look on a map here, although it's not exact, Japan's over here, has a very, very similar line of latitude to Europe and the UK. So when I go there, the biome is still a temperate forest, even though it's on the other side of the world. And that's because it matters more about latitude and how that impacts it with the climate. So, some review questions then. As always, I'd like you to answer these on a Word document and upload them. The first one is a definition. What is a biome? The second one, I want to describe the rainforest and tundra biomes. You can rewind this video to find the slide on that. I want things about its weather, about its temperature, about the types of plant animals that live there for that one. So any fact will do. And for the third one, why are biomes found on similar lines of latitude? So that's what I've just been talking about. I want to have a think about why maybe the climate in or the biome in Japan is the same as the biome in the UK. So explain to me exactly why latitude causes that to happen.